The sun hung low over the Arizona frontier, turning the dry earth to molten gold. The wind carried whispers of dust and old sorrow through the empty corral. Horses stamped restlessly, and the last remnants of a woman's laughter seemed to echo faintly from the porch, laughter that had long since faded. Clara McGraw, once the proud wife of a powerful rancher, stood at the window of the McGraw homestead, her hands trembling as she folded a worn shawl. Time had not been kind to her. The years of heat and heartbreak had carved thin lines at the corners of her eyes. Her husband, Ethan McGraw, a man whose pride was larger than his cattle empire, no longer looked at her as a partner, only as an inconvenience, a reminder of a youth he'd lost for 20 years. Clara had ridden beside him, through storms, droughts, and wars. She'd stitched his wounds, buried his cattle, and carried his name with loyalty. But as gold and greed took hold of Ethan, so too did vanity. He took on younger men to work the ranch, and younger women to entertain his nights. Clara's world shrank to the quiet of her chores and the silence of her prayers. One evening, after a long cattle drive, Ethan rode back with a new man, a tall, broad-shouldered black ranch hand named Samuel, bought at auction from the southern border. The others called him Sam, a man of few words, eyes dark with history. Ethan introduced him without warmth. "This one's strong, knows horses better than most. Keep him busy." Clara noticed how Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he touched the reins, not from fear but restraint. Something in him was tightly held, like a coiled spring that refused to break. That night, as the ranch hands celebrated their return with whiskey and laughter, Clara sat on the porch alone. From across the yard, Samuel passed by quietly, leading a lame horse toward the stable. When the wind caught her shawl and sent it tumbling, he stopped, picked it up, and handed it back with a quiet bow. Their eyes met, hers tired, his filled with a kind of solemn respect she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once. "Ma'am." In that small exchange, something gentle stirred, not love, not yet, but the faintest recognition of another soul enduring in silence. Days passed. Ethan grew more cruel. His temper flared over minor mistakes, and he took to drinking earlier each day. He mocked Clara in front of the men, calling her old bones and the ghost that haunts my kitchen. The men laughed nervously. Samuel did not. He looked away, jaw tightening. When a storm came, it ripped through the ranch like a curse. Roof shingles flew, fences broke, and a dozen cattle were lost. Ethan blamed Clara, accusing her of bringing bad luck, of praying too much and working too little. She stood silent as he raged, her face pale under the lightning. Samuel stood nearby, soaked to the skin, holding a broken gate upright against the wind. For a brief moment, his eyes met hers again, and in them she saw not pity but defiance, as though he silently promised that he saw her suffering. The next morning, Ethan did the unthinkable. At breakfast, with the men seated around the long wooden table, he slammed down his cup and said coldly, "I'm done feeding a wife who's forgotten her use. She'll serve better as company for the slave, since he's got no woman of his own." The laughter that followed cut through Clara's heart like glass. Samuel froze mid-bite, his face hard as stone. "You'll sleep in his quarters now," Ethan sneered. "Let's see if he can stomach what I no longer can." Clara's breath caught, shame, fury, disbelief, all choking her at once. Samuel stood slowly, his voice deep and measured. "Sir, that ain't right." Ethan turned on him. "You speak when spoken to." But Samuel didn't sit down. His eyes burned. "She's your wife, a good woman. You dishonor her. You dishonor yourself." Ethan struck him across the face with the back of his hand. The room went still. Samuel's lip bled, but he didn't move. He just stared at Ethan, not with hate but a quiet strength that frightened even the other men. "Take her, then," Ethan hissed. "Since you think she's worth something, she's yours. But don't you dare come near my house again." That night, under a moonless sky, Clara carried a small bundle to the slave quarters, a rough cabin near the corral. Her dignity lay shattered, her heart hollow. But Samuel opened the door without hesitation, stepping aside to let her in. "You don't owe me words," she whispered. "I know," he said gently. "But you don't deserve this." He laid his blanket on the floor for her, refusing to take the bed. The rain began to fall outside again, soft and steady. For the first time in years, Clara wept, not from weakness, but from the unbearable truth of kindness found in the lowest place. As the storm rolled across the plains, the ranch stood silent, except for the creak of the windmill and the faint sobs of a woman who'd lost everything except the one thing her husband had never understood. Her worth. End of Act 1, the deserted ranch, tragic setup of betrayal, humiliation, and the spark of a forbidden bond. The desert night was cold, and the wind scraped against the boards of the small cabin where Clara now lived, a punishment meant to break her spirit. But inside there was quiet, no shouting, no mocking, only the crackle of a small fire and the steady sound of rain on the roof. Samuel sat by the hearth sharpening an old knife, his face hidden in half-light. He didn't look at her, not out of indifference, but respect. Clara sat on the cot, clutching her shawl, her eyes red from tears she hadn't wanted him to see. "You should sleep," he said softly. "I can't." He nodded, setting the knife aside. "Ain't easy the first night away from what you called home." She looked around the small cabin. Rough walls, no curtains, a dirt floor. "This isn't home," she murmured. "It's exile." Samuel poked at the fire. "Sometimes exile's the only place a soul finds peace." His words lingered in the air, heavy and strange. She realized he wasn't like the other men. There was a calmness in him, a dignity that didn't fit the label slave. The way he spoke, it felt as though he had once known freedom and refused to let the world take it from his heart. Days passed and the ranch changed its rhythm. Ethan rarely came near the slave quarters now. The men snickered when they saw Clara walking with the wash or carrying feed buckets, but they didn't dare say much when Samuel was near. He worked harder than all of them, mending fences, taming wild horses, plowing through noon heat that would break most men. Clara began helping him with the small garden behind the cabin. At first they spoke little, just practical words, but slowly, like roots breaking through hard earth, small conversations began. "You ever miss where you came from?" she asked one evening, planting corn seeds into dry soil. Samuel wiped sweat from his brow. "Every day, but missing something don't bring it back. Working keeps the pain quiet." She smiled faintly. "I used to believe that too." When he looked at her, there was no pity, only understanding. The look of someone who had also been discarded by the world. One afternoon, Ethan's younger ranch hand, Billy Crane, a cruel and lazy man, swaggered near the cabin while Samuel was away herding. He leaned on the doorway and smirked. "So this is where the boss's old lady lives now. Bet it's cozy being the slave's woman, huh?" Clara froze, her heart pounding. "Leave," she said quietly. He chuckled. "Don't worry. I won't tell the boss how close you and your new man are getting." She turned sharply, her eyes flashing. "You'll do no such thing." Billy took a step closer and stopped when the sound of hooves thundered behind him. Samuel appeared on horseback, eyes dark and cold as a storm. "You got business here, Crane?" Billy sneered, but the strength in Samuel's presence made him falter. "Just paying respects to the lady." "Then you've done it. Now ride." Billy spat into the dirt and walked off, muttering. Samuel's jaw was clenched tight. When he turned to Clara, his voice was low. "He won't trouble you again." She looked at him, trembling. "He thinks we're together." Samuel met her eyes steadily. "Let him think what he wants. I'll not let him or any man touch you in hate." For a moment, something powerful passed between them, unspoken, forbidden, but real. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from the unbearable gentleness of his words. For years she had been shouted at, dismissed, treated as a relic. Yet here was a man considered beneath her by law and status, and he was the first to defend her dignity. That night, as she sat by the fire, she spoke again. "My husband says I'm too old to love." Samuel's hand stilled on the knife handle. "He don't know what love is." She gave a bitter laugh. "He once did, maybe." Samuel looked into the fire. "Some men mistake owning for loving." His tone was low, steady, but it struck deep. Clara whispered, "And you? What do you know of love?" He hesitated. "Enough to know it ain't cruel." Outside, a coyote howled. The world seemed to pause. Clara reached for the teapot, but her hand trembled and the cup slipped, shattering on the floor. Instinctively, Samuel reached forward and caught her wrist before she bent to the shards. Their eyes met again, inches apart. The firelight caught the lines on her face and the scars on his hands. They said nothing, but everything passed in that look. She pulled away gently, breath unsteady. I should sleep, she whispered. He nodded, voice rough. Good night, ma'am. But neither of them slept much that night. The distance between their two hearts grew thinner than the wooden wall that divided them. Weeks passed and whispers spread through the ranch. Ethan's drinking worsened. The men began to talk, that the old woman and the slave were spending too much time together. Billy's smirk turned to open hostility. One morning, Clara awoke to find the small garden trampled, the water bucket overturned, and a crude sign nailed to the fence. Property belongs where it's sold. She gasped. Samuel found it minutes later, rage boiling beneath his calm surface. I'll find who did this. No, Clara said quickly. Don't give them what they want. He turned to her, eyes burning. They want to see me act like what they call me. But I won't, because you deserve better than this world gives you. Her voice broke. Why do you care? He stepped closer, his tone low and fierce. Because no one ever cared for me neither. And when I see you... He stopped himself, fighting emotion. I remember I still got a heart. The words hit her like a prayer. In that moment she realized that her punishment had become her deliverance. What her husband gave her in scorn, she was beginning to see as a strange, cruel mercy. That evening Samuel rode into the desert to mend a broken fence. He didn't return by nightfall. Clara waited by the fire until the moon rose high. Worry gnawed at her chest and until she heard gunshots in the distance. Her blood ran cold. She ran outside, heart pounding, staring toward the canyon. The horizon flashed again. 1, 2, 3 shots. Then silence. The night swallowed her cry. The dawn broke red over the desert, a cruel burning red that painted the sky like spilled blood. Clara stood on the porch of the slave cabin, clutching Samuel's hat in both hands. He hadn't returned through the night. The horses in the corral shifted restlessly, their nostrils flaring at the scent of something foul on the wind. Violence. She could wait no longer. Grabbing a lantern and her shawl, she walked toward the ridge. Her boots sank into the sand, her breath ragged in the thin morning air. Every sound made her heart jump. A rattler's tail, a crow's cry, the hollow creak of the windmill far behind her. When she reached the edge of Coyote Canyon, she froze. Below, in the dry gulch, lay a broken fence cart and blood smeared across the rock. The dust was disturbed by hooves, and near a boulder, a trail led deeper into the canyon. She crouched, touching the blood, still damp. Samuel, she whispered. By midday, a group of riders appeared in the distance. Ethan and 3 of his men, led by Billy Crane. Clara hid behind a rock as they dismounted. Billy's laughter echoed harshly. Reckon he's learned his place now, he said. Ethan spat into the dirt. He should have known better than to talk back. A man forgets his rank, he gets reminded. That's the law of this land. Should we tell the old woman? One asked. Ethan's eyes were cold. Let her find out her own way. Clara's heart stopped. They'd gone after Samuel. They'd beaten him, maybe killed him. When the men rode off, she waited until their dust faded, then climbed down into the canyon, her skirt tearing against the rocks. Every step was agony. Every drop of blood she saw on the sand was another blade twisting in her chest. Half a mile down the canyon, she found him. Samuel lay by a dry creek bed, one arm draped across his chest, shirt torn and bloodied. His face was swollen, his breathing shallow. But he was alive, Samuel. She fell to her knees beside him. His eyes flickered open, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Didn't think you'd come. Don't speak, she said, voice trembling. We have to get you out of here. She tore her shawl, wrapping it around his shoulder wound. His blood soaked into the fabric, dark and warm. He grunted in pain. Who did this? She whispered. He coughed, then muttered, Billy, and your husband. Tears blurred her sight. I'll get you home, he smiled weakly. That place ain't home. Not for either of us. She tried to lift him, but he was too heavy. She built a makeshift sling of branches and cloth, using a mule tethered nearby to drag him slowly back toward the cabin. The sun burned overhead. Vultures circled high above, patient and watchful. By dusk, they reached the cabin. Clara worked quickly, washing his wounds, grinding herbs she'd learned from the Apache women years ago when the ranch first opened. He drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering fragments of his past. A lost wife, a child he never met, the chains that had brought him west. When night came, she sat by his side, holding his hand. "You saved me once," she whispered. "Now it's my turn." Outside, the coyotes sang again, long, mournful cries that sounded almost human. But peace was short-lived. At sunrise, Ethan appeared at the cabin door, reeking of whiskey and fury. 2 men flanked him. "Well," he said, stepping inside, "I see the stray found his way back." Clara stood protectively in front of Samuel's bed. "He's dying," Ethan sneered. "Good. Saves me the trouble." "You've done enough," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You've turned this land into a graveyard of your own soul." Ethan's face twisted. "You think you can shame me? You who's sleeping with a man I bought?" Her hand trembled. "He treats me like a human being, something you forgot how to do." The words struck harder than any bullet. For a moment, Ethan just stared, his pride cracked open. Then his rage exploded. He backhanded her across the face. Clara fell, striking the edge of the bedpost. Samuel's eyes snapped open. With a hoarse cry, he lunged, grabbing the iron poker from the fire. The movement was slow, he was half dead, but the strength of desperation filled him. He swung the poker, catching Ethan in the ribs. The rancher stumbled back, cursing, then drew his revolver. "Don't!" Clara screamed. The gun fired. The sound shattered the morning silence. Samuel fell to his knees, clutching his side. Ethan stood over him, chest heaving. Smoke curled from the revolver barrel. "You never learn your place," he hissed. Before he could fire again, Clara threw herself at him, clawing for the gun. The shot went wide, grazing her arm. She screamed and shoved him back with all her strength. They struggled, rolling on the dirt floor, the gun skittering across the room. Samuel, bleeding badly, crawled toward it. His fingers closed around the handle. Ethan rose first, turning toward him. "You'd shoot me, you?" Samuel raised the gun, his arm shaking. "Not for me," he rasped. "For her." The second shot echoed through the hills. Ethan McGraw fell where he stood, eyes wide, a final curse dying on his lips. Clara covered her mouth, trembling. Samuel's strength gave out. The gun slipped from his hand. He fell back against the bedpost, gasping. "It's over," she whispered. He looked up at her, eyes dimming but peaceful. "No, Clara, it's beginning." She pressed her hand to his wound, tears spilling. "You can't leave me now." He smiled faintly. "You gave me more than freedom. You gave me something I never thought I'd feel again." "What's that?" she sobbed. "Love." His hand went still in hers. Outside, the wind rose, carrying dust across the desert like ashes. The ranch lay silent, a kingdom of cruelty brought low by the simplest truth. That love, born in chains, can still destroy tyrants. By the time the sun set, Clara had buried them both, her husband on one side of the hill, Samuel on the other. She marked Samuel's grave with the only words she could carve with a knife. "He loved me like no one ever." Then she packed a single bag, saddled a horse, and rode away from the ranch without looking back. The desert swallowed her silhouette, a lone figure riding into the dying light, free at last, carrying both sorrow and grace in her heart. The morning after the gunfire, the desert was silent, too silent for a ranch that once rang with men's voices and horses' hooves. Clara stood beside 2 fresh mounds of earth on the hill above the McGraw spread, the wind pulling at her gray hair. Beneath one cross lay her husband, Ethan McGraw, the man who'd built an empire on cruelty. Beneath the other, Samuel, the man who had given her heart a second life. She looked down at her hands. The soil was still caked beneath her fingernails from digging their graves. Every motion hurt, but she didn't stop until both men were covered, one beside the other, separated by a few paces, enough distance to keep peace even in death. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp against the sky. Clara whispered, "You're free now, Sam." The wind answered like a sigh across the mesa. By midday, she saddled Ethan's gray mare, packed a few coins, water, and Samuel's small Bible, the only thing he'd ever kept from his old life. As she rode away, the ranch shrank behind her, swallowed by dust. She didn't look back. The law would come, and when they did, they'd find 2 bodies and a missing wife. Let them think what they wished. Her path wound north toward Silver Rock, a mining town 3 days' ride through canyon and sage. She rode until the sun sank, her body stiff, her soul raw. When she finally stopped, she built a small fire and warmed her hands over it. The plains stretched endless around her, silent except for the distant howls of coyotes. Every sound pulled her thoughts back to Samuel, the way his voice softened when he said her name, the look in his eyes the night before he died. She pressed the Bible to her chest and whispered, "I'll keep you with me always." By the second night, fatigue overtook her. Her lips cracked from thirst. She dozed in the saddle until the horse stumbled, nearly throwing her. When she steadied it, she saw shapes moving against the horizon, riders, 3 of them, heading fast. Panic struck. She spurred the mare into a gallop, dust swirling around her like ghosts. But the desert was open and merciless. There was nowhere to hide. The riders gained ground. When they came close enough, she saw the star pinned to one man's vest, Sheriff Denton out of Yuma. Behind him, Billy Crane rode with a bandaged arm and a hateful grin. "There she is," Billy shouted. "The old witch that shot her husband?" Clara's pulse roared in her ears. She drove the horse toward a narrow canyon split by the dry riverbed of Devil's Hollow. The mare leapt over rocks and scrub, but the men followed close behind. Bullets whined through the air. One struck a boulder beside her, showering her with stone. When the canyon narrowed, she pulled the reins hard and ducked behind a rocky ridge. The horse trembled beneath her. She waited, breathless, until the hoofbeats grew faint. Then she dismounted, leading the mare through a thicket of mesquite toward an abandoned shack left by prospectors. Inside, she collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. Her arm throbbed where Ethan's bullet had grazed her days before. She tore a strip from her skirt and bound it tighter. For a long time, she sat there, staring at Samuel's Bible. Night fell. Through the cracked window, the moon shone on her face. She opened the Bible, running her fingers over the worn pages. Between them, she found something she hadn't seen before. A folded scrap of cloth embroidered with initials. S+C. Her breath caught. It wasn't hers. Samuel must have sewn it himself, quietly, without telling her. The thread was crude, but the care was there. She smiled through tears. "You fool," she whispered. "You loved me that much." A noise outside froze her, the crunch of gravel under boots. She blew out the lantern, heart pounding. Through the slats, she saw Billy Crane's silhouette. The moon glinted off his revolver. "Come on out, Mrs. McGraw," he called. "The law says you're wanted for murder." Clara's voice cracked. "Go to hell, Billy," he laughed. "Already there, darling. But I figure dragging you back alive will buy me a ticket out." She crept to the back door, clutching the pistol she'd taken from Ethan's body. When Billy kicked open the front, she slipped out and circled behind him. The wind howled through the canyon, whipping dust around them. "You took him from me," Billy snarled, turning. "That slave made a fool of all of us." Clara steadied her hands. "He made a man of you look small. That's why you killed him." Billy raised his gun. They fired at the same time. His bullet tore through her shoulder. Hers struck his chest. He fell hard, cursing, eyes wide with disbelief. Clara staggered back, gripping her wound. When the echo died, she heard hoofbeats again, Sheriff Denton's men closing in. She mounted the mare with her last strength and rode into the night, clutching her bleeding arm. The canyon blurred around her, red rock glowing under the moon like fire. By dawn, she reached the open desert again. Her shoulder burned. Her breath came shallow. She knew she couldn't keep running forever. On a ridge above the Rio Santa, she stopped to rest. Below lay water, glinting like silver in the early light. She slid from the saddle and knelt by the riverbank, washing blood from her hands. The cold stung but cleared her mind. She looked east where the sun rose behind purple hills. Somewhere beyond them there might be peace. She whispered to the empty air, "If they catch me, Sam, I'll tell them the truth. That I loved a man they said I shouldn't." A gentle breeze stirred the reeds beside her, carrying a single feather that landed in the water. It drifted past her fingers and away downstream, behind her. In the distance, faint voices called her name. The sheriff's men, following the trail. Clara stood, took one last look at the horizon and mounted her horse. She didn't spur it hard this time. She rode slowly, her figure small against the boundless desert. A widow without home or law, carrying the ghost of a love the world would never understand. The desert had never been so quiet. The wind, once screaming across the mesas, now moved like a whisper between the rocks, like a dying prayer. Clara sat by the fire, its glow soft on her worn face, the years and tears carved deep as canyon lines. She had ridden for days beside Elijah, the man once branded a slave, now her only protector. And though their journey had nearly broken them both, There was a peace between them that no one else could ever have given her. They had found an abandoned mission nestled at the edge of a dried riverbed. Crumbling adobe walls leaned against the dying sun, and the bell tower stood cracked but proud, like an old preacher refusing to fall. Here, Elijah said, they could rest. No one would find them this far from the towns, this far from him. Her husband, the rancher who had once called her too old, who had traded her dignity for vengeance, was still out there, somewhere. She could feel it like a thorn in her skin, but tonight she chose to believe in silence. Elijah built the fire carefully, his hands strong but trembling. "You should sleep," he murmured. "The world's quieter now." Clara smiled faintly. "It's never quiet in my head." He looked at her across the flames, the orange light catching his scarred cheek. "Then I'll sit with you till it is." They didn't speak for a long while. The stars opened wide above them, thousands of eyes watching two lost souls trying to find warmth. The only sound was the fire crackling and the slow rasp of Elijah's breath. Clara studied him, the gentleness in his movement, the kindness he'd shown even when the world gave him none. "You could have left me," she said quietly. "You could have run after he gave me to you. Why didn't you?" Elijah's eyes lifted slow and full of pain. "Because I was born a slave, but I was never meant to live like one. And the day he gave you to me, you looked at me like I wasn't one either." Clara turned her gaze to the flames. A tear slipped down her cheek and vanished into the dirt. "He hated that," she whispered. "He hated that you were more of a man than he'd ever be." Days passed. They worked the mission's garden, tried to bring life to the dry soil. For the first time, Clara laughed again, soft and brief like a ghost of youth. Elijah carved a small wooden cross for her, placing it in the garden's center. "For new beginnings," he said. She didn't tell him that she'd stopped believing in miracles long ago. Somehow his faith made her want to again. But the desert had long memories, and peace in the Old West never lasted. One morning, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Clara froze. Elijah's face hardened. Through the dust, 4 riders appeared, the lead one dressed in a long black coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Her husband. The past had come to collect its due. They surrounded the mission, revolvers glinting under the sun. The rancher dismounted slowly, his boots crunching the dirt. "Well," he sneered, "I'll be damned. The old mare still breathes." Elijah stepped in front of her, silent, unarmed. The rancher tilted his head. "You think you can keep what's mine, boy?" "She was never yours," Elijah said. The world seemed to hold its breath. The rancher laughed, bitter and hollow, and drew his gun. Clara moved first, an instinct, not thought. She grabbed Elijah's arm, pulling him down as the shot tore through the air. The bullet grazed her shoulder and buried itself in the cross Elijah had carved. Elijah reached for the fallen revolver of one of the men, eyes blazing. Another shot rang, this time from his hand. One man dropped. Then another. Dust and gunfire filled the holy air. The smell of smoke, of blood, of justice, or maybe damnation, hung heavy. When it was over, only 3 souls still breathed. Clara, Elijah, and the rancher, who lay wounded, clutching his gut. He looked up at Clara with hate and something almost like disbelief. "You chose him." Clara's voice shook but carried like thunder. "No. I chose peace." The rancher's head fell back, his last breath lost in the wind. That night the fire burned low again. Elijah tended her wound, hands gentle, eyes distant. "We can go north," he said softly. "Start over. New names. No one needs to know what we were." Clara smiled weakly. "The world already knows, Elijah. The desert remembers everything." He reached for her hand, and calloused meeting calloused. And for the first time she felt no shame in the touch. But her wound had gone deeper than either of them knew. The fever came by midnight. She tried to speak, but her words melted into whispers. Elijah held her as she shivered, his tears falling into her hair. "Don't go," he begged. "You're the only thing that ever made me free." Clara's eyes fluttered. "Then remember me that way." The fire dimmed. The night deepened. And as the dawn broke, pale and red as old scars, Elijah buried her beneath the wooden cross she had bled upon. The same one that had stopped the first bullet meant for him. Weeks later, travelers would find the mission abandoned again. They would speak of the black man who stayed by a grave in the desert, whispering to it each night as though the woman beneath still answered. And when they asked who she was, he'd only say, "She was my sanctuary." The wind carried his name across the plains long after the gun smoke cleared. Some said they'd seen him, a lone rider cloaked in dust, a shadow moving through the canyons at dusk. Others swore he was a ghost, bound to a promise made in a dying woman's arms. But the truth, like the desert, cared little for stories. It only remembered the footprints and the graves. Elijah stayed by the mission for weeks after Clara's passing. The world beyond the cracked adobe walls had gone silent again. But the silence this time was heavier. Not peace, but absence. He spoke to her as though she still tended the garden, as though she might answer from beneath the cross that marked her rest. At dawn, he'd kneel by the grave. At dusk, he'd read to her from the old Bible he found inside the chapel. Its pages torn, words faded, but still breathing. "You said the desert remembers," he would murmur. "Then let it remember you." Each day he rebuilt what time had broken, patched the roof, cleared the sand from the floor, fixed the bell so it could toll again. When it finally rang one sunset, echoing through the empty canyons, it sounded less like salvation and more like goodbye. By the time winter came, Elijah's strength had begun to fade. He hadn't eaten in days, but he didn't care. He was waiting for something, or maybe someone. One night, as the cold wind swept through the mission, he heard a soft sound outside. The desert alive again, whispering her name. He rose slowly, his body trembling from hunger and grief, and walked to the garden. The stars were bright that night, too bright, the kind of sky only the lonely notice. He knelt by Clara's grave, tracing the wood of the cross with shaking fingers. "I kept my word," he said softly. "Ain't no one ever took me from you, not even death." He leaned his head against the cross and closed his eyes. The fire inside him had burned too long, and now, finally, it went quiet. When the dawn came, the mission bell tolled once, moved by the wind alone. Weeks later, a caravan of settlers passed through the valley. They found the ruins half buried in sand, and two graves side by side beneath a crooked wooden cross. The older of the two carried a single line, carved with care, "She was my sanctuary." The other, freshly marked by hand, read only, "He never left her." The settlers buried them proper and rode on, but the story grew with every retelling. By the next town over, folks said Elijah had turned into a coyote, howling at night beside her grave. A month later, they said the mission bell still rang at sunset, even though no one lived there to pull the rope. By the following spring, travelers began leaving flowers on the road as they passed the valley, whispering that love, the kind born in chains and pain, had found a way to live forever. Years passed. The West changed. The railroads came, the guns quieted, and towns rose where the wild once reigned. But still, in the evenings, when the desert light burned gold and the wind turned warm, the bell at the old mission sometimes rang. One slow, solemn note. Old cowhands would pause, tip their hats, and say, "That's her man," calling her home again. And just like that, the story lived on, not in books, not in graves, but in the breath of the desert itself. For in that unforgiving land where dust swallows every trace of man, the only thing the wind refused to bury was the love between a slave and the woman the world called too old.